Okay. We're just gonna assume that. Is this on?
I don't know, but we're missing my goat partner.
He's here. I saw him.
Yeah, I know.
I saw him like 5 minutes ago. Afterward, I'll definitely want to get a picture with the four of you.
Yeah.
So hang tight.
Yes. We will hang tight.
Do you all care if I take one of these? Do you all care if I take one of these?
No.
No? I'm going to.
Where's James Folino, my goat? We do what now? Put your coat in that stack. Okay. Keeping time.
Thank you all so much for your attendance this afternoon. My name is Dr. Lauren Bisker. I am an assistant professor of rhetoric, film, and screen studies, as well as the director of the Brooks Quimby Debate Council at Bates. What a tremendous honor and pleasure it is for me to introduce an event of such worthy tradition on our campus, the Reverend Dr. Benjamin Elijah Mays Debate. Before Dr. Mays became an architect of the civil rights movement, an iconic college president who transformed Morehouse into a powerhouse of the liberal arts, and a mentor to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. himself, Dr. Mays was a Batesy, class of 1920. In Dr. Mays' senior year, he also earned the title of captain of our renowned debate team. For Dr. Mays, debate was both a place of warm hospitality and unfortunate hostility. Dr. Mays watched as his white teammates were accepted into the prestigious National Debate Honor Society, Delta Sigma Rho. But despite his exceptional abilities as one of the best debaters on the team, despite his oratorical skills that would one day make him an advisor to several US presidents, and despite his teammates' fight to end Delta Sigma Rho's policy of exclusion, he wasn't admitted until long after graduation from Bates, when the society finally desegregated in 1935. Nevertheless, in Dr. Mays's 1971 autobiography, Born to Rebel, he reflected on the time he spent on this very campus, noting, quote, "One of my dreams came true at Bates. Through competitive experience, I had finally dismissed from my mind for all time the myth of inherent inferiority. I had done better in academic performances, in public speaking, and in argumentation and debate. I had displayed more initiative as a student leader. Bates College made these things possible. Bates College did not emancipate me. It did the far greater service of making it possible for me to emancipate myself, to accept with dignity my own worth as a free man. Small wonder that I love Bates College," he expressed. And at Bates College, we certainly love Dr. Mays back. We thank him for teaching us that education is a most vital resource in our ongoing pursuit of social justice. It is therefore our privilege to honor the Reverend Dr. Benjamin Elijah Mays by debating the following motion. Resolved, this House believes that social justice movements should practice a politics of anger. Our outstanding keynote speaker for the day, Dr. Maisha Cherry, has produced excellent scholarship that examines the role of rage in racial justice advocacy. So too was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. concerned with this topic, offering a complicated assessment of anger's place in our struggle for social change. Dr. King once cautioned in his speech titled "The Other America" that, quote, "angered expressions of despair could produce bitterness in the violent rebellions of civil rights activists." On the other hand, Dr. King also recognized anger's positive potential in his 1968 commemoration of W.E.B. Du Bois, expressing that, quote, "the supreme task is to organize and unite people so that their anger becomes a transforming force." I guess we'll see what our debaters have to say. To begin, you'll hear 4 8-minute speeches from our speakers, which will be followed by a 15-minute audience participation session. During this period, audience members, you all, can offer comments about your perspectives on this topic, or you can ask our debaters questions. We ask that you please keep your comments to no more than 30 seconds. Then, after the audience participation session, our debaters will offer 2 5-minute speeches of rebuttal. And now, let's introduce our teams, which each consists of 1 Morehouse debater and 1 Bates debater. Affirming or supporting the motion on the government team, we have A.C. Abner and Tosca Newman. A.C. is a second-year student at Morehouse College, double majoring in political science and economics on the pre-law track, where he studies political movements, the development of legislation and legal precedents, and global socioeconomic conditions. He sees debate as a way not only to bring much-needed discourse to critical topics, but also to raise awareness and broaden others' perspectives. He serves on the editorial board of the Morehouse Spelman Pre-Law Society and has devoted his time to political advocacy through programs such as the Morehouse Advocacy Reaches Capitol Hill Ambassadorship. Next, Tosca is a senior at Bates College who is originally from Germany, and they are majoring in classical and medieval studies. They are passionate about debate as a tool to create community and as a debate as a space for positive discourse. Let's give a big round of applause to our government team. Opposing the motion, we have Janias Lunsford Peaks and Tanvir Tamid. Janias is a second-year philosophy major at Morehouse College, where he focuses on ethics, logic, and political thought. He is deeply passionate about debate as a tool to bring forth conversation rooted in critical inquiry and civic engagement, and he is committed to advancing social justice through both legal advocacy and public discourse. In his free time, he serves on a council to better the lives of Georgia youth. Tanvir Tahmid is a democracy activist from Bangladesh and a senior at Bates College majoring in economics. He is the co-founder of EdBridge Scholars, an education-focused platform aimed at expanding access to academic opportunities. Let's hear it for our opposition team. I now call this House to order. We'll hear first from our government Prime Minister, Tosca.
Throughout history, social progress has not been driven by calm acceptance, but by organized outrage. A revolution was born from fury at slavery. Labor rights emerged from anger at exploitation. Civil rights were advanced not because the oppressed were patient, but because they were fed up. To deny anger is to deny the emotional reality of oppression. First, some necessary characterization and framing about this debate. This debate is about whether anger should be treated as a legitimate and central political resource, rather than something that motions and movements ought to oppress in favor of calm, love, and respectability. We are not defending a politics of fury or rage, one that is violent, uncontrolled, or hateful, but by politics of anger, we mean the deliberate organization, legitimization, and strategic deployment of collective anger in order to favor and forward social justice. This can take many forms, including the use of language that doesn't appease, but rather confront the oppressor, and by using aggressive strategies of non-violent civil disobedience. First, then, why anger must be organized and not suppressed. Dr. King's warning was never anger is bad. His warning was that unorganized anger becomes destructive. Note that anger will always be present and a major force in any social justice movement that struggles for justice. Is it part of human nature to feel outrage and anger when we see both ourselves be treated as less than, and in many instances when we see those around us also be treated as less than, based on arbitrarily constructed metrics and categories. The question then is how this anger should be treated by social justice movement. A politics of rage does three things. First, it collectivizes anger. Individual despair becomes shared among different grievances, preventing nihilism and isolation. Secondly, it directs anger upwards, towards systems, institutions, and power, not towards scapegoats and lateral violence. Third, it disciplines anger through strategy. Protests, strikes, campaigns, and clear demands transform emotions into outcomes. Suppressing anger doesn't alleviate it, it pushes it underground where it erupts in uncontrollable ways. A politics of anger uses the force and impetus that come with strong emotions to further causes like liberation, equality, and resistance. Our first substantive argument then is that social justice movements are more effective when they practice a politics of anger. First, anger is a rational response to injustice. Anger is not a moral failure, it is a significant harm. It is a sign that significant harm is occurring and that people are affected by the circumstances of their oppression. Oppression isn't abstract. It is experienced in the poverty, the humiliation, and the devoidness of resources that comes with systematic factors that keep us suppressed. Anger then emerges because something is wrong, not because people are irrational. Movements that deny and mask anger make marginalized people lie about their lived reality. This creates movements that are emotionally dishonest and politically weak. These movements also lose their appeal to those they most want to appeal to because they're perceived as appeasing to the oppressor rather than siding with those who are struggling for justice. Movements rely on critical masses. If you can't achieve those, you as a movement have nothing to go for. Note too that most oppressed groups don't feel love towards those who are oppressed by them. They feel anger and they're motivated by this anger that has kept them going for often decades and centuries. Second, we think that anger creates urgency and mobilization. Political change doesn't occur because people are gently persuaded. It happens because people are fed up with the circumstances they're facing. Anger then motivates people to strike, protest, boycott, and engage in civil disobedience. Love and appeals to peace can never motivate people on the same psychological level. In many instances, it's even seen as oppositional to taking actions like protests and striking. Second, these actions often require sacrifice, and sacrifice requires a degree of emotional intensity that oftentimes only anger at the situations you're facing can actually give you. Third, mild concern and appeasing language don't sustain mass participation over a long time. Love softens the language on inequality and fails to paint a picture that demonstrates the need for direct action. Only outrage can do this effectively. Change, however, is predicated on protest and mobilization to happen in the first place. One, those in power are disincentivized from and disinterested in making change to the status quo that benefits them and keeps them in power. It requires a strong showcasing of political opposition in order for there to be an impetus in the first place to make these kinds of changes. But also, two, wider audiences can easily change the radio station, scroll past the TikTok, or avoid the uncomfortable situation that forces them to engage with inequality that doesn't pertain to them. It is much harder to ignore protests on the street, people boycotting brands like Starbucks, or people doing wide acts of civil disobedience. This forces them to familiarize themselves or at least acknowledge the issues and the inequality that is happening around them. This is the first step in order to garner allies, in order to have a broader supporter base that is needed to make any kind of structural change. But also third, we think that anger resists the co-optation and respectability politics. Movements centered only on love are easily neutralized. They're told to wait, they're told to be polite, and we think a politics of anger refuses premature reconciliation. It insists that justice comes before comfort, and that accountability must come before forgiveness. But also, fourthly and most importantly, anger sustains movements when hope is unavailable. The problem is that not all movements operate in moments of optimism. Some fights are long and stalled, and they come with significant setbacks over time. And during this time, hope in many instances can feel dishonest or gets lost. We think that anger is better than that. It is not predicated on the belief that change and better conditions are coming soon or are necessarily assured. We think that this keeps up the fighting spirit that is required for people to stay engaged in activism in the first place. This keeps movement alive during backlash and repression or slow reform periods where love or hope-based messages are often collapsing. This is the single most important link into success for a social movement that there can be. If efforts and buy-in can't be sustained over long periods of time, and especially at times of struggle, there's never possibility to make change in the first place. Even if then the opposition team can make any claims towards tangible benefits about mainstream buy-in to the movement, none of it even matters in the first place, because movements can't survive until they're broad enough to even appeal to the mainstream in the first place if people don't feel the impetus and the ability to make change in the first place. Our second and more smaller argument is the fact that politics of love alone is insufficient. There are two broad reasons. One is that love prioritizes a social harmony over actual material outcomes. A politic of love treats conflict as a problem to be minimized rather than a necessary feature for transformation. But social change inherently includes things like disruption, losses for those in power, as well as temporary instability. With love, you don't get any of these things. By privileging harmony, love-centered strategies resist escalation, strikes, mass disruption, the kinds of things that actually change the status quo, that make people feel like change is necessary. But secondly, love is easily co-opted by dominant institutions. Institutions are highly capable of performing love rhetorically. They do this in several ways. For example, by issuing apologies, by acknowledging harm, by affirming shared values. These gestures often satisfy the moral demands of love-based movements without actually altering the material arrangement that people are facing. Anger, by contrast, is harder to absorb because it insists on consequences rather than recognition. Politics of love becomes vulnerable to elite capture, where movements are praised, consulted, and celebrated, while their demands are diluted or indefinitely postponed. Power doesn't move out of love. It moves when it is pressured. A politic of love always asks the oppressor to be patient, calm, and morally impressive while injustice continues. A politics of anger does the opposite. It makes harm visible, urgent, and impossible to ignore. Every real movement for change has been driven by people who are fed up, who were not just hopeful. Love can be the goal, but anger is what gets us there. This is why this House must affirm.
Let's now hear from our leader of the opposition, Janias.
In this debate, I oppose the motion that social justice movements should practice a politics of anger. We're not denying that anger is not a natural response to injustice, but we're saying there is a crucial distinction between feeling anger and being governed by anger. Anger, when institutionalized as a political strategy, is like fighting a fire to see in the dark. Like it may provide an immediate illumination, but ultimately it will burn down. So I'm going to introduce you into our three main points. The first being anger is a poor strategy. It trades direction for momentum. Anger polarizes, it builds walls where movements need bridges, and then we get anger shrinks movements, right? It drives people out instead of bringing them in, and then we'll provide to you our counterfactual, which is a politics of communication. So to our first point, a politics of anger is ineffective because it prioritizes emotional momentum over strategic direction. Anger moves fast, but it does not move wisely. Like a car with a stuck accelerator and no steering wheel, it very well may surge forward, but it absolutely cannot control where it is going to end up. So we see this clearly in real-world protests, that begin with legitimate grievances, but they begin to devolve into violence or destruction. When anger overtakes discipline, movements lose control over their narrative. The public stops talking about the police brutality, the economic inequality, or the discrimination that matters, that actually drives people to the streets, and instead the public begins to talk about the broken windows, the broken communities, and the burning buildings and public safety. And it is at that moment that the moral high ground that once existed then collapses. Anger also clouds judgment. It narrows our vision, making complex systems look particularly simple to enemies, right? In this emotional fog, activists are less likely to evaluate the consequences that are attached to their anger. They're less likely to build strategy, and they often consider long-term outcomes less. So in debate terms, anger wins the moment, but it loses the round because it doesn't last forever, which creates it creates a push for social media polarization, which leads us into my next point. Anger polarizes, and it builds walls where movements need bridges. So a politics of anger then fuels polarization and division. It creates a dichotomy of us between them, right? It doesn't invite conversation. It issues these ultimatums. And it treats disagreement not as a chance to persuade, but as proof of moral failure. In practice, this creates echo chambers, right? Supporters shout louder to those who already agree with what the claim is. Then it's politically fatal. Social justice movements don't actually succeed by preaching only to the choir. They succeed by expanding the choir. And when you have anger, the only people you reach are those that are already involved. History shows us that this constraint clearly doesn't work, right? The civil rights movement made its greatest gains not through unrestrained rage, but through discipline, right? Anger exists. We're not denying that anger is a human emotion, but we are saying that there is a way to control it and apply it. So, in honor of Martin Luther King, a leader such as himself understood that anger might not ignite action, but moral clarity and restraint, where what persuaded the nation, the movement did not just expose injustice. It made injustice indefensible. Anger, by contrast, often hands opponents an easy escape. They no longer have to answer to the argument. They only have to condemn the tone that exists, which then again detracts from the main claim. Then we get into the next point. Anger shrinks movements. It drives people out instead of bringing them in. So a politics of anger reduces participation, and it undermines stability. Many people, especially those who are the most vulnerable, who are not empowered by anger and they are frightened by it actually, when they see this level of activism, it feels volatile and hostile, and potential allies choose silence over engagement. An example we use is an individual who may be an illegal immigrant who wants to protest against ICE, but they are afraid that ICE may retaliate against them. Where do they fit in a space where anger doesn't exist? Anger also corrodes internal movement dynamics. It becomes harder to collaborate with these individuals, to disagree productively, or to simply build trust, right? A movement fueled solely by anger is like a candle burning at both ends. It burns brightly, but it is oh so brief. Real change requires endurance. It requires people who are willing to show up repeatedly, day after day, again and again, who are willing to organize patiently and work within the imperfect systems that they begin to transform. Anger is exhausting. It cannot burn and it cannot run forever. It cannot sustain that kind of long-term commitment that is required to make change. So then we introduce to you our counterfactual. This is what a politics of communication would look like. So now, if we consider the counterfactual, what happens when social justice movements reject a politics of anger and instead they begin to practice a politics of communication? A politics of communication treats anger not only as a weapon, but as data, right? It's a signal that something is wrong, yet it's not just a strategy, it's not just a strategy for fixing it, but rather than shouting to overpower opponents, movements speak to persuade them, and they frame injustice in ways that invite understanding, build coalitions, and translate moral outrage into policy change. It allows a space where more individuals are able to communicate effectively, efficiently, and slower, to which it creates the long-term change that is required for social justice movement, which is required for political change, which is required for anything that we want to happen. It's not momentary, it's something that we have to continue to work towards. So in the real world, as we've seen, this looks like the movements that prioritize storytelling over intimidation, right? We get organization over just sporadic and quick outbursts, and we get dialogue over denunciation. So it looks like activists who can sit across from skeptics and policymakers and even opponents and just make justice morally comfortable to defend, right? It happens when you have anger. It's uncomfortable to talk about it because you're afraid of what may come from it. So communication does what anger cannot. It expands the circle of concern. It expands people's willingness, their openness, and their aptitude to, solve these issues. So crucially, a politics of communication moves the scale in the direction of actual change in comparison to a politics of anger. It allows movements to grow beyond the most emotionally activated participants, and it includes and moderates institutions and undecided publics. It creates a space for disagreement without collapse, for critique without fragmentation, and for accountability without fear. Unlike anger, which burns, again, hot and fast, and it will burn out, communication builds an infrastructure, it creates a shared language, and it creates a trust, and most importantly, it establishes legitimacy to work with the individuals who are organizing these organizations and these claims and these protests to make them effective and last. And most importantly, a politics of communication produces durable change, right? Laws are passed, normatives are shifted, and institutions reform, not because they are shouted into submission, but because they are persuaded and they're pressured and they're reshaped through a sustained engagement. History shows us that justice endures when it is argued into existence, not forced through rage. So, when we weigh the two models side by side, the choice becomes clear that a politics of anger alone may express pain, very much so. It may express very real human emotion, but a politics of communication transforms it if just social justice movements aim not merely to protest the world as it is, but to build the world as it should be. And then communication, not anger, and that is why we get change in politics. Thank you.
Next, we'll hear from our member of government, AC.
So quickly before I begin, I want to give an outline of what my speech is going to contain. Firstly, I'm going to get into my own points of positive matter and extensions off of my partner's points, which will serve as integrated rebuttal to what we just heard from the Leader of Opposition. And then after that, I will address the counterfactual that was brought to us at the end of that speech. Benjamin Elijah Mays once warned that the circumference of life cannot be rightly drawn unless the center is set. For social justice movements, anger is not a loss of control. It is the moral center that gives direction, urgency, and force. Without anger, movements do not bend history. They merely ask politely while injustice persists. So what did we hear out of the speech from opposition today? So the first thing that we heard is that this feeling of anger, being governed by anger is not acceptable, and it will overtake the actual means of what these movements seek to achieve. But what we see practically and throughout history is that it is not anger that governs these movements. It's rather anger serves as a catalyst for these successful movements. When you look at the civil rights movements, when you look at King, when you look at not just MLK, but when you look at Malcolm X, these movements, while they were catalyzed by anger, while they got people out to fight for what they believe in, they were not consumed by anger. They were very strategic in which the ways that they placed these movements, in which they placed these riots, in which they placed certain marches, for it to be televised, for it to be seen, for people to understand the agency and the urgency of what was going on in this moment. So to extend off of my partner's first point about it being more effective, about politics of anger being more effective, I'd go as far as to say that anger is the birthplace of that change, so acting as that catalyst. Fannie Lou Hamer, one of the political rights activists at the DNC in 1964, proclaimed a critical mass of African Americans were sick and tired of being sick and tired. It is not just enough to be discontent with your circumstances, but rather that anger that drives you to actually act on that discontentness and actually take action is what actually changes things. Look at the Black Lives Matter movement if we want to look at a contemporary example. When we saw George Floyd put on his neck, when we've seen police brutality persist throughout America and throughout all 50 of our states, we saw that people got out. They not only were just angry, but they were organized. We saw that there was a home base. We saw that there was a lasting movement that continued throughout that time to address the injustices that were occurring within that group. Let's look at what it looks like when you don't employ that politics of anger. For example, when Trump was elected in 2024, a lot of people were discontent with some of the policies that he wanted to put out. A lot of people were discontent with some of the messaging he had, but he still won. Why? Because Democratic voters who thought that Democrats were not actually doing enough to be active, to be progressive, were getting out to the polls. But once people were galvanized under that collective anger of what was happening to our communities, to an increase of violence by ICE, to our standards of living being decreased, to it being more expensive to even just survive in this country, then you saw a higher turnout in local elections and primaries because people are realizing that you galvanized under that force of anger that you feel when these injustices are happening to you. Let's pull it back from contemporary examples all the way to women's suffrage. We saw that women, black women especially, were galvanized under this idea that we need rights too. We've been giving rights to men, we've been giving rights to other marginalized groups. Why are we not getting the same treatment? That was not something that was overrun by anger to the point where you cannot run a sensible and organized campaign for justice, but rather one that people could unite under, and we saw actual change being made. Secondly, to extend my partner, inclusion does not lead to advancement. While there may be a higher burden of entry on a movement of anger because some people will be deterred from such strong messaging, it actually, when it's premised on anger, there's actually a stronger movement that occurs as a result. So there's a higher capacity for change when you see a movement that is based off of anger rather than one that is simply just based off of love, which, as my partner has already stated out, is insufficient on its own. Martin Luther King Jr. himself, one of the examples that my opposition used, stated that he fears that he has led his people into a burning house. He wrote this in his paper on integration, in his dream where he wanted to have the marginalized communities, whether that be African Americans, whether that be poor, those who are under the thumb of capitalism, to be integrated into the white majority or into the capitalistic society that they have been shied away from. He realizes, with the teachings of Malcolm X, who sees this alignment or this integration as coffee with the cracker, so to speak, or dinner with the enemy. King realizes that this may be the case of what he's been building with this integration movement, and realizes it's a politics of anger, which he turned to in his more radical approach with the Poor People's Campaign, that is actually going to create change. My opponent stated that anger shrinks movements and that it brings upon polarization. But why would I want to sit at the same table with an enemy who does not understand me? That enemy is not going to listen to what I have to say until that I put forward my politics of anger, my messaging, and show exactly why it is that I need justice for myself, why I need justice for the groups that are in question here. So that only happens when you go outside of the system and when you bring upon your own change. Audre Lorde states that you cannot dismantle the master's house with the master's tool. I cannot side with the master. I cannot side with the enemy who has oppressed me, who is creating these injustices upon my behalf, and expect the change that I want to see unless I am willing to take my feelings of anger to galvanize a movement, to bring a group of people together. And while the burden of entry may be higher, again, the change, the impact, the ceiling for change is much higher when you utilize anger in your politics. And again, we want to make the clear distinction that anger is not just something that is a loose cannon. Anger is not something that is like not well thought out, right? Like there's a clear distinction. There's a clear distinction to be made between hatred and anger. Hatred is the fury of those who do not share our goals, and it is object to death and destruction. But anger is a grief of distortions between peers, and its object is to change. When you let your grievances be known, when you allow people to understand what it is that you're vying for and the change that you need to see happen, people will get behind you in those movements. And this is not just like conjecture, but we see this happen. For example, look at the Stonewall riots in 1969, right? When we saw that the LGBTQ community was vying for their own rights, just being able to live, be free, be in bars by themselves, and the NYPD stormed a string of gay bars. What happened? They didn't just sit there complacently and allow themselves to go to jail. There was a reaction. There was a violent reaction. They amassed a group of people who said no, that we should be able to represent ourselves. We should be able to have our own representation. And they fought back against the police. And what were the long-term effects of that? While my opposition may say that anger is a candle that burns brightly and burns fast, what we actually saw was long-term change out of a movement just like that. In light of the Stonewall riots, we saw the formation of the Gay Activist Alliance, of the Gay Liberation Front, and we saw it catalyze a pride movement that actually led to getting a lot of rights for that LGBTQ community. We see that long-term change actually happens. To contest this point about anger not being thought out and it not being strategic, let's look at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, on a fateful day known as Bloody Sunday. It was very tactical for you to amass the group of black activists out on that bridge where they knew they were going to be met with violence and aggression by the police, by people who did not believe that black people and marginalized groups should have equal rights. But what we saw actually happen was, because of the broadcasting of that fateful day, of that bloody event, we saw that rights were given birth to, such as the landmark Voting Rights Act of 1965. We saw that people actually saw liberation when a politics of anger was employed, because it is not enough to just say you love someone and say you love your brother, but you have to actually stand on what it is that you believe. You have to take action, and that is what you get when you take on politics of anger. Thank you.
Let's now welcome our member of the opposition, Tanvir.
When Martin Luther King Jr. stood at Lincoln Memorial, he did not say, "I am angry." He did not say, "You're evil." He did not say, "Burn the system down." He said, "I have a dream." And this is exactly what opposition stands for. We believe that the communication of love is something that still can be effective. We believe while anger is justified, we believe while I am literally shivering every single day, given that maybe ICE could come up and take me away and deport me, even then, I believe that communication is the key way we can actually win their heart and actually make sure that those injustices that happens to us are going to end, because people are going to realize what these injustices are. People are going to band together, and people are going to protest against all the injustices that happens all around the world. And now I know I may sound like an utopian person with a lot of ideas that might not seem grounded in reality, but exactly this is what we should aim for. We should aim for a world in which we all can imagine, we all can have dreams, and we all can end up having things that were deemed impossible by the previous generation and by people who did not believe things can be done. For their dreams to be true, we need to dream in a way in which that may seem impossible. I'm going to do a few things. First of all, I'm going to respond to their argument about efficacy, and secondarily, I'm going to talk about why the alternative, i.e. the counterfactual, is better. In terms of efficacy, I have 6 responses to this particular argument. What they say is, first of all, there is a sense of urgency that is created, and you're more likely to do sacrifices, and you become harder to ignore. The first response that I'm going to make is that it creates a fraction within social movement. And you need to realize it. Not every one of us gets to be angry. A lot of us are peaceful individuals who do not think that at the very end of the day, anger is something that is justified. This is given the fact that our social conditioning made us in that way, which is to say, once we read religion, once we are studying in a particular college, in every places we are told violence is never justified. This is something that is indoctrinated within us, which means that the anger of politics is not something that everyone subscribes to at the very first place. What this means is the kind of people you empower are the individuals who are okay to be very angry and violent, which means that within the movement, those are the voices that gets loud, and the people who want to be not angry are the people who are shunned away. And this is really problematic because their case relies upon your being able to structure the anger. And in order to structure that anger, you need more rational people in the leadership. And that is not something that you are able to attain under their side of the world. The second thing that I want to respond to is by saying that people cannot afford to actually be angry in many instances. Because given that they want to protect the most vulnerable, imagine a black person who is living a very poor life. Given the fact that if he is going to be violent, and if he is going to be violent, he's going to go into jail, or he's probably going to lose his job. This is an immense sacrifice that he needs to make, which means that the only people who can practice the violence of anger are individuals who are already quite privileged and who are okay to go into jail, or who are okay to be activists who really don't rely on those particular jobs and all of those kind of things, and are okay to afford to be violent or be angry at the very end of the day. Why is that being angry at the very same time means you are likely to be violent? And I know this is important because anger doesn't always generate violence. But the truth of the matter is, when you are angry, when you are constantly trying to say that everything around you is unjust, you start justifying the actions you took given the fact that everything is unjust. This is when you are okay to break down things. This is when you feel it is okay to be violent and to break things apart. This is exactly why the third response, i.e. why anger generates more violence. The fourth thing that I want to say is about the optics. Oftentimes, the optics are really, really bad, which is to say, oftentimes, when you are recorded as someone who is doing this violence, when you are shown in the TV media as someone who is not being civil, you are going to be shown as someone who is not a good person. This is immensely important because of the fact that you want more people to join your movement, and when they deem you as someone who is angry, as not someone as civic, and when this is portrayed in media and social media, more and more people are unlikely to subscribe to your movement. This brings to my fifth point, which is the fact that moderate people like ourselves are often unlikely to join this movement when they see this kind of thing. And the last thing that I want to say is the justification of state violence. Oftentimes, like for example, when I was protesting in Bangladesh and the state opened fire against us, the reason why the state could not justify their violence is because we were being peaceful. It's because of the fact that they fired on people without any weapon. They fired on people who were being civil. And that's how we said that your violence is unjustified. You don't get to kill us. This is where we think that to be able to communicate, to be able to be a good citizen is sometimes super crucial. What do we prove in the counterfactual? We believe that we bring in reconciliation. We believe that we bring in persuasion. We believe that we are able to find the middle ground. We believe that there are a lot of individuals who are ignorant, who does not understand the struggles of ourselves in the same way in which we do. In many instances, our lived experiences are very, very different. The lived experiences of you and the lived experience of myself, even though we probably believe in the same political ideology, is still very, very different. That brings us to the point in which that we believe that it is needed to have communication, not only to the people who you have similar political ideology with, but even with people who you do not agree with. And this is exactly what happens under our side of the world. In our side, you get to talk to people, you get to communicate with people. Instead of using anger as a tool to communicate, you're able to use facts. You're able to use actual ideological discussion that brings them to actual middle ground. Because some of them may have justification of their beliefs. It's hard to agree, but in some cases, they may have some rational logic. We need to have those discussions in order to ensure that they are going to understand us. And under our side of the world, when we are able to break down the wall, when you're able to have a heart-to-heart conversation, only then we are able to have a communication that will end us having success in our social movement. We are very, very proud to oppose.
Okay, so we're now entering the audience participation period of our debate. If you'd like to offer your perspective on this topic or ask a question of our debaters, feel free to raise your hand, and we'll have people walking around with microphones. Just as a brief reminder, please keep your remarks to right around 30 seconds.
Hi, my question is for the opposition. Given the current intense, volatile political state we're in, how would you argue the relevance of communication over anger when you're engaging with an opposition that's going to be violent either way?
Hello. Oh, okay. A lot of you have watched the recent meeting of Mamdani and Trump. And honestly, when I saw that, it really made me feel really happy. It's because it's important to have communication. While we think that the opposition is really terrible, and trust me, I believe that it to be true, as much as I can say that. But at the same time, we need to realize that there are other people who are voting for Trump who also voted for Mamdani. This is important because our opposition is not a single entity. Our opposition is not just that one particular person or one particular team. It is also the moderate individuals who needs to have a communication with us. And this is how Mamdani was successful, because he was able to speak to those people, and communication is the way in which you are able to do it.
I have a question, and it's to both sides. It seems like you guys have differing definitions or maybe applications of anger, and I was curious if both of you could define anger in a sentence or two, because one side seems like it's more rational and strategic, and the other is perceiving anger as irrational and erratic or sporadic. So if you could just simplify it down to one or two sentences, excuse me.
Yeah, I can. So on our side, I feel like anger is more so defined as a moral or righteous emotion that's kind of supposed to emerge from perceived injustice, right? So when your norms are violated or your rights are violated, that emotion or that spurring action that's representative, that's what anger is. And it's somewhat of a justified or transformative tool that's almost necessary when you have a political response to systemic oppression.
And in our case, we use anger as it is a human emotion, so we acknowledge that it's going to happen, it's natural, but we tend to believe that it gets out of control. Anger is not a consistent disposition we believe you can keep. We think it's temporary, it's something you're supposed to feel, and you're supposed to use it and transform it into a way of communicating, but it should not be your long-term disposition.
So this question is for the opposition. On opposition side, we get a lot of claims about anger breeding violence all of the time and this being a negative. But I guess I'm sort of unclear on how violence is always a consistent negative for a political movement.
Yeah. Well, I'll take the first half, and then I'll let Tanvir do the second part. By virtue of my being a philosophy major, I don't believe in universals, so I'm not making the claim, at least, and if I did, it wasn't intentional, to make the claim that anger always produces violence. But it is not unbeknownst to anger, right? They tend to go tandem together, as we've seen, and we mentioned riots and buildings and things of those examples of that realm. But we are saying that, again, like it happens, but it's not unforeseen to us that anger is something that produces a lot of violence, especially when it's uncontrolled and individuals do not have the capability to communicate how to effectively use their anger. And that's usually what we're aiming to get at in Tanvir.
We give several structural reasons as to why anger is going to beget violence in many ways. For example, what sort of voices are going to become the louder voice within a social movement? Who are the people who are likely to do this particular sort of social movement activism? Or the fact of in terms of just anger in of itself, how it creates a sort of polarization that leads to violence and things like that. So that was more of a characterization of, even though anger doesn't always lead to violence, but why politics of anger being used at a consistent manner is likely to manifest into those kind of violence in many instances.
This is more so just a comment or a compliment, I guess, to both sides, because I took a class called Performance in Politics recently, and we talked a lot about this idea of politics as what you would hope to or think to be is just people reading different policies, being very intentional, and deciding to vote one way or another based on just facts and all this logic that you think goes into politics, when in reality it's a lot of performance and a lot of symbolism and a lot of getting people's emotions going. So I do appreciate that both sides took into account that all of politics is really driven by emotions, and it's more so how you manage it and which ones you decide to use.
Thank you.
This question is for the government side. While anger can create change, can it truly last? We've seen advancements in social movements over the years, but in recent years, we've also seen those advancements quickly torn away. So how can the anger that fuels these movements truly lead to cohesion and conversion of the masses?
I think the first thing I want to say is that I think there's an important distinction between politics of anger and politics of fury. And I think lots of the things that are destructive about social movements when they use anger is when they use fury and rage rather than a productive kind of anger. And I think our case has been premised on people using a more productive kind of anger that doesn't lead into violence, for example, which I think oftentimes does imply that lots of the progress is taken away retroactively. I think the reason then that I think we do lead to much better long-lasting change, a lot of this is going to come from the reply speech, is probably the fact that I think in order for politics of communications or love to work in the first place, you need to be given a seat at the table first. People need to listen to you first. And I think in most instances, you need to be angry and loud and tell people that you exist, that you're oppressed, and that you matter in order to be listened to. And I think this kind of long-lasting change only happens when you're loud, proud, and angry.
And just to quickly add on to that, to answer your question, I feel like there's been a lacking of politics of anger in more recent times. So when you talk about these drawbacks of rights being attained and then this retrenchment of them almost, I think that the way in which we describe politics of anger, so civil rights movements, or when you see people like Charles Hamilton Houston with the Black Panther Party building up this civil rights cases out of anger of things that have happened, this structured kind of movement has kind of disappeared. I feel like it's, or at least been diminished to an extent. So
got a hand over here. Yeah. For both sides, concerning a politics of anger and a politics of communication, how do each of these ideas work when maybe your opposition doesn't respect you as an individual, as a person, or as a group, and perhaps never will?
I guess this is more for the opposition bench. Yes, you were right. Being ignored, not being okay to listen to is something that is really frustrating, and it really makes us think that the only response to this is violence. However, at the very same time, I believe that it is important to have patience, and any big advancement that happened in the last century or even this century didn't happen in a single day. And it's very infuriating that there are people who wouldn't allow us to practice the civil rights that we have worked so hard to achieve, and suddenly they want to take everything away from us. But at the same time, I believe that all of the people who are probably joining the bandwagon of these evil people are not actually evil. They might be ignorant, and in order to break the wall, we need to have more communication. And yes, there are evil people, and at the same time, there are a lot of people who are not evil, and we want to target those people and be able to talk with them.
Just to quickly answer your side for us, I think that the point of politics of anger is actually to employ them when you understand that there's not an agreement on the other side, right? So I do believe, and I stated this in our case, but with Martin Luther King with his speech on integration, and then Malcolm X, kind of this rejection of sharing a seat at the table with someone who clearly doesn't see you as equal, right? That is when you employ politics of anger the most, because it's not just about integration. It's not just about coming to that common place of understanding. What you have to do first is kind of establish what it is that you need, what it is that your people need, and then take that on against what the oppressive force may be, and that's when you reach that understanding, right? It's not just by communication.
This is a question for both sides. Do you think a politics of communication and a politics of anger are necessarily exclusive politics to hold?
I can start on our side. I don't think that they're necessarily exclusive, but I think in many instances they're questions of sequencing in a way, where I think politics of communication can only work at the time when, for example, you're seen as an equal, someone who deserves to be listened to, someone who's a human just like the person who makes choices. And I think in many instances you have to be angry and loud first in order to be seen as someone who deserves attention. So while I don't think that they're exclusive at all, I think one has to come prior to the other, and in most instances it's anger.
And I can agree to that. I don't believe that politics of communication nor politics of anger are mutually exclusive, and I agree as well with Tosca that it's a matter of sequence. I do believe that anger is, in its exigence, it's a start to understanding and it's a start to communication. And to my understanding and ours of how we've formulated the case is understanding comes from communication. And the best way is that piece of experience. And your feeling, and attached to that is the anger. So we believe that anger comes first, but it's not the long-lasting disposition to make effective change.
So I think both sides have been doing really well in terms of explaining what politics of anger looks like and what the structure is to lasting change. However, I have a question for the opposition in terms of how do you think lasting change can occur when politics in and of itself is about media attention, it's about pushing to those who might not be aware, and in a case where the people who hold the power to media attention are those who actually are oppressive, how do you allow yourselves to be in a position where you can be listened to if you don't have access to the the platform that allows you to be heard in and of itself?
I think that you are right, that again, oftentimes these people who are part of this social movement are vulnerable minorities who doesn't have a seat on the table either side. So this isn't only true for our side of the world, this is also true for their side of the world, because these are minority individuals or vulnerable individuals who don't access to the seats. So I think that the bigger question then is, how do you get to the seat at the very first place? And we're trying to say that under our side of the world, given that we use the tools that are more likely to appease to the majority, that is more likely to be something that majority people are willing to stand behind, is likely to help politicians, for example, to be like, okay, I can stand behind this particular movement because this isn't as controversial. This is something that majority of the people think is a good idea. So that may bring to these particular politicians who also have the incentive to get elected to be like, okay, I support your movement. I know, again, this sounds very simplified and probably doesn't sound very grounded in reality, but again, we have to try. I think on both sides we have really huge struggles, and we don't get to get into the utopia that we all hope for, but it's all about how we can get there the best way. So that's why I think that we are able to do it better.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, my question's for the government side, and I think my question is, anger is usually directed with some sort of target to it. So my question is, where is politics of anger once the target of it ends up conceding, being removed, or changed in some way, and there's still work to be done, and that anger has somewhat dissipated?
So I think, well, to answer your question, I don't think that the work is like, I think you're right in saying the work's not done just once you've like identified that target, so to speak, of like that movement, or right. So like, for example, when King, right, like galvanized like the Poor People's Campaign around like we need to kind of like battle this like oppressive like capitalist regime that's like keeping all these people down, and oftentimes it was marginalized racial communities, right? The work wasn't done when the campaign kicked off, or when he galvanized all these people against like the government that was pushing these like kind of capitalist, anti-marginalized group like regimes, right? Like what you have to do after you kind of carve that seat out of the table for yourself is utilize the power that you get when you get there. And I think that applies beyond like just like social justice movements such as the Poor People's Campaign, right? You can look at like contemporary politics, right? Like when you take seats in a house, whether you be Democrat or Republican, what is it that you do when you get there? Like, I think that's the focus. It has to be like bringing all these people together to focus on like specific aims once you get the power, once you put that seat at the table, and that's like where the fight like really starts to begin.
All right, well, thank you so much to all of you for participating in such a productive discourse. We really appreciate it. We're now entering the rebuttal phase of the debate, and in the style of debate that we do, the opposition team will speak first. So I call upon our member of the opposition to conclude the opposition's case. Tanvir.
Resentment is like drinking poison and then hoping it will kill your enemy. And this is by Nelson Mandela. And this is really important to understand in this debate. The anger of politics that they talk about over and over again is failing to understand your opposition. It's failing to reconciliate with individuals who are around you. What they say are very simple. They say that change is necessary, but love is unable to bring that change. Love is unable to collectivize people. We don't think that is true. We think that love is something that is universally something that is much more powerful than anger. The fact that you care about other people, the fact that you empathize with individuals who are struggling is something that is very unique to our perception as human beings. And this is something that they fail to understand. The people that they talk about are about being evil are not all evil individuals. These are individuals that we can still communicate to instead of trying to build a bigger wall at the very end of the day. They talk about at the very end of the day about how they become harder to ignore. But it's not really true, because what happens when you try to consistently become angrier, you try to undermine the other people at the very end. There creates a point of otherization. It's when people start blocking other politicians. It's when people start blocking the friend that believes in a particular cause instead of having a conversation. It becomes easier for you to ignore your best friend because they have a different political ideology instead of trying to have a communication. Under our side of the world, you as the friend talk to that particular person. You as the friend talk to the people who you believe has lost his cause, and you are able to have that communication. But under their side of the world, the individuals who have different ideologies now have a justification to block your friends. The justification being, he doesn't listen to me, he is not willing to have a civil conversation. This means you are never exposed to the other ideas that exist. So if they come up and tell you that you become harder to ignore, it is much easier to get ignored under their side of the world. They don't talk about optics, and this is very important because optics is so important because you're never going to get a seat on the table if you're not going to be civil. And this is the reality of modern civilization. This is where we think we win this debate, because if you want to get invited in a TV interview, or if you want to actually express these ideas, you have to conform to the civil ideological codes that exist. And I know this is like kind of frustrating. I would love to be here not wearing the suits, not wearing all this shirts and everything. I would much rather wear a t-shirt and give my speech. But that's the reality of this modern civilization, where everyone expects you to actually work in a particular way that conforms to the norms that exist in the civil code. And that's exactly where they fail to understand. This is where we live in. We talk about a reality. We talk about actual success. Under their side of the world, they live in a utopia where anger leads to all of the justification that they try to talk about, but they never tell you how that happens. We talk about people like Mahatma Gandhi, who was able to bring independence in India. We talk about the people who are able to use peace. The reason why Martin Luther King is considered the hero of the civil rights movement, and Malcolm X is not, or in some instances, not as big of a leader as Martin Luther King, is because of the fact that Martin Luther King conformed to those same narratives. Did they have the same level of contribution? Maybe they did. Maybe one of them had a bigger contribution than the other. But it's also not about what the reality is or what the utilitarian calculus tells us. Because the world isn't rational. If the world was rational, every single one of us would have the right that we deserve to have. The world is stacked against us, and we have to win the war in a world in which this is unjust. And we are able to give you the best path to victory, the best path as to how you can get there. Every one of us have the same goal. We just tell you how to achieve that goal better. For all that reason, very, very proud to oppose.
All right, we'll conclude with the government prime minister, Tosca.
At the end of this debate, you have two questions. First, what movement has better overall buy-in? Second, what movement achieves better change? Both questions will be answered, as well as various responses to the argument that the opposition gives us are going to follow in the next roughly 5 minutes. First then, what groups gets better buy-in? I think there's two rough groups that we care about when we talk about buy-in into social movements. I think the first is whether or not the oppressed individuals themselves buy into the social movement that is meant to liberate them, i.e. do black people in the 50s buy into the civil rights movement, or do they not buy in? The problem with the opposition case is that they rely on methods that don't work, which creates huge-scale buyout. First, on the idea of love. I think love is insufficient to motivate people in many instances. I think most oppressed people do not feel love towards their oppressor. It's not something that motivates them. It's something that they don't feel. They don't feel loved and they do not love back. Instead, they feel anger towards them, and that is what motivates them to want to make change in the first place. We only get that on our side of the house. Then they say, oh, we get a politics of communication, and this creates buy-in, and people join because this works. They don't explain to you how this communication actually works in the real world. We tell you it doesn't. In order to be listened to, in order to communicate with anyone, to be invited to town hall meetings, to be invited to talk on talk shows, you need to be given the space in the first place. You need to be seen as a moral and civic other. In most instances, this is not true for people who live under severe oppression. They never get the chance to communicate. The only way that they get to communicate ever is when they ask for space, when they demand it, when they take it, when they take the streets with anger, when they tell the oppressor that they are people just like everyone else and that they deserve to be listened to. That's what we tell you about sequencing. Even if love and communication work, you need to be angry first. You cannot communicate without first claiming space. You only get that inside government. I think then you just don't get buy-in from groups themselves because their movements don't work. Because why would you want to join a movement that's supposed to liberate you that doesn't work whatsoever? Secondly, then on the age of broad buy-in, they tell you, people don't buy in because they see this as violent. First, I want to point out that we very specifically tell you that we don't promote fury and rage and large-scale violence. We promote a productive kind of anger that makes people want to stand up and advocate for themselves. I think this takes out large parts of their offense here, but even if, I just don't think that broad buy-in happens in the first place, because in many instances, people need to be made aware of the oppression of others, because we don't see that gay people, for example, don't have the same rights. If I'm a straight white man in the 60s, I need to be told about this first. I need to be made aware. I need to see that police officers get bricks thrown at them to see that there's an issue in the first place. I think we, again, only get this broad scale of buy-in of allies and people who are a broader support structure if we have this mechanisms through which we claim space. So I think buy-in really only happens on our side of the house. Lastly, and briefly on splintering, Tanvir and the opposition say, oh, this splinters movements because people perceive this as being violent. But first, I just don't think this large-scale violence actually happens, and I don't think splintering happens from this because of the things we already told you. But secondly, I think splintering, once again, happens on their side of the house when people buy out of movements that are vastly ineffective. Splintering happens is when the gay community leaves behind the LGBTQ movement because they don't feel represented, because trans people aren't seen as equal members of the gay community, or when people of color who don't receive, for example, when black women buy out of the civil rights movement because they don't feel represented only by black men. I think this is when splintering happens and when movements become vastly ineffective. Secondly, then, where we get better change. They say, you just talk to people and communicate. I already told you why this is not going to be happening, but I think more importantly, I think even if you buy that people are given the space to discuss their struggles, I think the way that you have to do this leads to significantly worse changes that actually occur, because if you, as an oppressed person in the 60s, talk in a talk show, the way that you get buy-in and change is by watering down your movement, by sending the people that are the least controversial, by sending the people that make the lowest burden demands that still make some kind of progress. I think that the progress that you get from this is significantly worse, and I just do think that on our side of the house, when you force those in power to reconcile with the fact that oppression happens and that people care, this is when you actually get change on our side of the house, when people take to the streets and the people in power can't ignore you. That's when policy changes happen. That's when people realize that what they do is politically not popular. That is when change actually occurs. Again, I think we're the only side that gets this. You cannot dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. If they can give you one example of a movement that is successful, that doesn't rely on anger and that doesn't rely on protest, but one that relies on love and care and all of the things that they talk about communication that happens when you don't try to claim space, then they can win the debate. I don't think they've done this. I don't think they can. You need anger first, then you can love.
I think that all of our speakers here tonight should be so proud of the ways in which you make contributions to productive types of discourse that sustain democracy and that promote social justice. So let's give all of our debaters one more round of applause. On behalf of the Brooks-Quimby Debate Council, we are so deeply grateful for everyone's attendance here tonight. In the words of Dr. King, may our anger become our transforming force. Thank you.